Hello everybody, my name is Sarah and welcome back to Educating Adventures. Today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about one of the most unusual and exciting ecosystems in the ocean. This ecosystem is very well known for having a wide variety of different animals, everything from lobsters to sea urchins to fish to sea otters. If you're thinking maybe today we're going to spend a little time talking about kelp forests, you're exactly right. Let's get into it. Before we get ahead of ourselves, I'm wondering if any of my friends are maybe kind of familiar with kelp forests already. So go ahead and take a moment to pause the video, discuss as a group or think to yourself, what do you already know about kelp forests? What are they like? Well, let's take a look, because like all ecosystems, kelp forests have biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic factors are the living parts of the ecosystem, and abiotic factors are the non-living parts. Let's start with the abiotic or non-living parts of a kelp forest. Definitely one of the non-living parts is going to be the water. Kelp forests are usually found in cool, nutrient-rich water, which makes them a little bit different than a coral reef, which usually likes to live in kind of warm tropical water. Kelp forests are usually found not too far from coastlines, typically where the water is a little bit shallow. They do need to be able to reach the sunlight, which we're going to come back to in a little bit, and we usually find kelp in areas that have a rocky sea floor. Let's go ahead and switch over to a biotic factor or living part of a kelp forest ecosystem. We of course have to start with the kelp. The term kelp is used to describe about 30 different species of large brown algae. And the term kelp forest does a pretty good job telling us what this ecosystem is like. Like a forest on land, which has a bunch of trees all growing very close together, a kelp forest in the ocean has a lot of kelp, very tall, growing very close together. And algae is not a plant, but it is similar to a plant in that it uses photosynthesis to get energy. This makes them different from animals who get their energy from eating things. Photosynthesis is a process used by plants and algae, which takes energy from the sun and changes it into sugar or usable energy for the plant or algae. This is why we find kelp growing in places that are still pretty shallow, because they need that sunlight to get energy to grow big and tall. Even with all that energy from the sun, most plants and algae grow pretty slowly, but not kelp. Some species of kelp can grow as much as 18 inches in a single day when conditions are perfect. Like many other types of seaweed, kelp is attached to the ocean floor using something called a holdfast. I usually like to think about holdfasts kind of like above ground roots. They hold on to the ocean floor so that the kelp doesn't drift away. And the kelp grows upward because throughout the kelp are these bubbles that are filled with gases. We call them pneumatocysts. And because gas floats, it kind of pulls the kelp up toward the sunlight so that it can grow toward the surface. Kelp is considered to be a keystone species, which is a species that is so important that if we removed it from the environment, that ecosystem would collapse. So if we removed kelp from the kelp forest, there would be no more kelp forest, right? It would collapse. So that makes sense. And we're going to come back to keystone species in a little bit. Now there are a couple other biotic factors that we need to discuss in kelp forests because kelp forests are home to hundreds of different types of animals. Everything from mammals like sea otters, fish like California sheephead, and even a bunch of different types of invertebrates like sea urchins. With hundreds of different types of animals living in a kelp forest, there must be a reason why. So go ahead and take a second to think. Why do you think that so many animals call kelp forests home? Well, I'm wondering if it maybe has something to do with the same reason so many animals on land call forests homes. And I think it might. Kelp forests, like a forest on land, provide two very important things. They provide food and they provide shelter. Lots of animals come to the kelp forest to eat the kelp or even to eat little animals, and meanwhile the little animals are using the kelp forest to hide from their predators. Let's spend another minute talking about the different types of animals in a kelp forest and how they rely on it. Because kelp forests are usually found pretty close to coastlines, there are lots of birds that use the kelp forest as their hunting ground. Everything from gulls to cormorants to herons are all going to be using kelp forests to look for small animals to eat. There are predators in the water as well, like leopard sharks and octopuses and large fish, which are using the cover of the kelp forest to ambush or sneak attack their prey. Kelp forests are also home to lots of benthic animals, or animals that live on the ocean floor. Everything from spiny lobsters to sand dollars to brittle stars to those sea urchins we mentioned before. And we're going to take just a couple minutes here to talk about two of the animals that we've mentioned today, those sea urchins and sea otters. Sea urchins are very common in kelp forests because they eat the kelp. They use their 5 sharp teeth to chew through the holdfast of the kelp. And when that happens, the rest of the kelp floats away. And if there's too many sea urchins in a kelp forest, they can detach a ton of kelp very, very quickly and destroy the entire kelp forest ecosystem. But luckily, there are predators like sea otters, which are able to feed on the sea urchins. They dive way down deep to the bottom of the ocean floor, they collect the urchins and they bring them to the surface. Once at the surface, they use a rock to help break open the sea urchin, get past all of those tough spines so they can get to the meat, the good stuff, inside. If there were not enough predators like sea otters keeping the population of sea urchins in check, we'd have a really big problem. Remember we said before that kelp is a keystone species because without it, the kelp forest wouldn't exist? Well, we often consider sea otters to also be a keystone species because without them eating all the sea urchins, we wouldn't have a kelp forest. The environment would collapse. This relationship between kelp and sea urchins and sea otters is one of my favorite examples when talking about how important balance in an ecosystem is, to make sure that all the different parts are healthy and their population sizes are right so that everything can stay balanced and functioning the way it's supposed to. All right, you guys, well, if you would like to learn a little bit more about kelp, more about the threats that kelp forests are facing and how you can help, be sure to visit that link below. Visit our website. We've got quizzes, activities, projects, and so much more. And I can't wait to see you at our next adventure. Thank you.